Good evening, comrades. Thank you very much for joining us to this next session in our series on Israel-Palestine. Tonight, we're looking at the Balfour Declaration, the Ottoman Empire, or the other way around, and Zionism before the foundation of Israel in 1948. Bear with us. Both our speakers are not 100%. You might have seen that Tony was arrested yesterday on anti-terrorism charges. Very serious, I'm sure, for one tweet. Comrades will have probably seen it. Absolutely absurd. We're very glad you managed to join us despite the fact that your phone and computer were confiscated. So, comrades, this is not going to be quite as planned, but we're very pleased you were both able to make it. So the format is we're going to have Tony first for 20-25 minutes, then Tom, and then we're going to open up for questions on contributions from the floor. So thank you very much, Tony and Tom, for joining us. Over to you, Tony.
Okay, right. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, good. Okay, thank you for all of you attending, nearly 80 people now, in fact. As Tina said, I was subject to a 7 o'clock raid at my house, and they confiscated all my computers, my mobile, everything. So I've spent much of today trying to get back online, and I've had very little chance to prepare for this talk. So really, it's going to be a stream of consciousness as much as anything else, and then we can take questions and so on. The Ottoman Empire, I won't confess to knowing a great deal about it. It's not my area of speciality, but it ruled from approximately 12 to 1917 in Palestine. And it was a vast sprawling empire. It was dominant in much of Europe until it was thrown out. I think it reached its epiphany in the unsuccessful siege of Vienna. And they were slowly forced to retreat. But nonetheless, it occupied vast swathes of the Middle East and the Arab East. And it was called the sick man of Europe because it was really an ancien regime, in many ways, a feudal empire that was busily trying to modernize. And the political expression of that was the Young Turk Rebellion, I think in 1908. As regards Palestine, I think the crucial date probably really is 1858 with the introduction of the land code into Palestine, because previously land had been held by hamulas or villages, really collectively. There was no individual title to them. And the peasants farmed them collectively. But the 1858 land code of the Ottoman Empire introduced individual registration of land, and in the process confiscated large swathes of that land as so-called wasteland. And that incidentally was the basis for much of the later Zionist colonization and justification of seizing of land as well. I mean, this really represented the intrusion of a Western capital into the place, into the Ottoman Empire. And the land increasingly became part of a, if you like, the market economy. It became owned because you had to individually register the land after 1858. And many peasants couldn't even afford the registration fee, and it fell into the hands of very large, often absentee landlords like Sir Suck of Lebanon, Beirut, who in turn sold large chunks of it, especially in the Jezreel Valley, to the Zionists, enabling Zionist colonization to build up. But as I say, the Ottoman Empire was called the sick man of Europe. It was massively in debt to the European powers. The people may know Theodor Herzl, the founder of political Zionism, when he traveled to Constantinople and entered into talks with the Ottoman Sultan offered, and I don't think he had much backing for this, but to take on at least part of the debt, and it promised that the debt would be met if the Ottomans agreed to grant a charter for Zionist colonization. Nothing much became of that. But to say the European powers, in particular France, Britain, and Germany, got their claws into the Ottoman Empire. And they did this by sponsorship of the various religious interests. The Germans, for instance, there was quite a large-scale colonization of Templars, the Knights of the Templars. The French, the Germans, the British, and the Russians each had their own favorite church. The Russian Orthodox Church was one, the Greek Orthodox Church was another. And through religious interests, which often bought up large tracts of land as well, they increased in their political influence. The Zionists themselves, for those who are interested in the colonization, the first aliyah, the first wave of emigration from Europe to Palestine began in 1882, following the Odessa pogroms. Although the first Jewish settlement was in Petah Tikva in 1878, if I'm right. And these settlements soon ran into trouble because they weren't productive, and Baron Edmund Rothschild soon took over the finance and the reorganization of them in introducing land management. But the differences between these settlements and, if you like, the true Zionist colonization was that the administrators and the settlers preferred not to work on the land, but to employ Palestinian peasants because it was much cheaper to do so, and they reaped the rewards from that. The difference for purposes of Zionist colonization, and that began in earnest with the second aliyah, the Labour Zionist colonization in 1904, was that the settlers themselves did the work and therefore did not need to employ Arab labor. And in fact, they adopted a policy of kibush havadah, the conquest of labor. And what this meant in essence was that once a tract of land had been bought from an absentee landlord, usually, instead of the peasants being evicted from, if you like, sharecropping or farming it and then being re-employed as landless laborers, instead what happened was they were not employed at all. They were simply evicted from the premises altogether. And this caused bitter disputes. It was assassinations of many settlers, the formation of Jewish or Zionist militias. Bar Giora, I think in 1903, was the first, Hashomer in 1908, and then Haganah, which was the main Zionist terror army in 1920, formed directly by the Histadrut, the Zionist trade union. And I think it has to be understood in terms of we often refer, or people often refer to the Labour Zionists as the left wing of the Zionists because they believed they had a Marxist phraseology, Borochovism. Pole Zion was formerly Marxist, but their Marxism and their socialism was confined to the settlers themselves. It never applied to the Arabs. And the conference in 1906 of Palestine, the Palestinian Pole Zion, the main Labour Zionist party, there was a bitter dispute between Abraham Savransky and David Ben-Gurion, who became the first prime minister of Israel, as to whether they should organize with Arab labor. Savransky and others supported joint work with the Arabs because this was in line, of course, with socialist ideals. But those led by Ben-Gurion, who were in the majority, did not want to organize the labor at all. They argued that socialism only applied to workers who were already employed, not those who were excluded from the workforce altogether. So you see the development of Zionist apartheid from its beginnings. But during the Ottoman Empire, I mean, the Ottomans tolerated, sometimes they supported, sometimes they didn't, the Zionist colonizers. They hadn't had official permission, but then they didn't really need so. Sometimes impediments were put in their way. such as having to adopt Ottoman citizenship. But many of these restrictions were not enforced, not least because of the representation of the European powers who held sway over the Ottoman Empire in many ways, not least financially. And so we really come to the Balfour Declaration itself, and people may recall what it said. But there was a period of lobbying. It went on from about 1915, 1916, led by Sir Herbert Samuel, who was a Home Secretary under the Liberals, and later became the first British High Commissioner. He was an ardent Zionist. And in 1917, the War Cabinet under Lloyd George agreed to the Balfour Declaration, which was the British promising the land of another people to the Zionist organization, although of course they had no right to do that. This was in blatant contradiction, I should add, of the McMahon-Hussein correspondence in 1915-16. Sir Henry McMahon was the High Commissioner in Egypt, and Faisal Hussein was the father of Abdullah and Faisal, who later became monarchs in their own right. And in essence, although it was vaguely worded, it was quite clear that the British promised independence to the Arab state that would be formed in Palestine if they were successful. This was as part and parcel of the negotiations which Lawrence of Arabia made famous, whereby the Arabs of Arabia would join forces with the British. However, what wasn't realised at the time was that the British, who of course are known as perfidious Albion, had already negotiated, or in the process of negotiating, what became known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Sir Henry Sykes, famous British diplomat and adventurer and so on, and Picot, the French, I think, foreign minister, whereby Palestine and the Middle East, Syria, were divided into spheres of influence. Syria and Lebanon were to be allocated to the French, and Palestine, which at that time also included Transjordan, was to be allocated to the British. So we had the usual double dealing by British imperialism. Having made promises, they failed to keep them. It's interesting to note that I mean, people often see Jewish influence at work, but the British Jewish community was vehemently opposed to the Balfour Declaration, and in particular, the Board of Deputies. A famous letter was sent to the Times over the head under the names of, I think, the chair of the president of the Board of Deputies and the chair of the Anglo-Jewish Association, Claude Montefiore and Alexander. And there was a heated debate over that letter, in fact, at the Board of Deputies. But it's interesting to note that in the War Cabinet, which approved the Balfour Declaration, the only dissentient voice was of its only Jewish member, Sir Edwin Montagu, a Liberal member who later became High Commissioner or Viceroy, High Commissioner, I think it was, Secretary of State, that's right, for India. So the Anglo-Jewish bourgeoisie was vehemently opposed to the Balfour Declaration. And in fact, they formed an organisation after the war, the League of British Jews, precisely to campaign against the Balfour Declaration and the consequent Zionist colonisation. Reasons are many given for the Balfour Declaration, such as winning over the Jews of Russia because of the Bolshevik Revolution, which took place almost at the same time, winning the support of American Jews for the war effort, oil interests in the Middle East to secure those. But I think the main reason which was given by Chaim Weizmann, the first president of the Israeli state, was protection of the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal was the main artery for trade and the shortest route between Britain and India being the jewel in the crown of the empire at that time. I mean, it's still a very important route, let's be quite clear, but at that time it was even more important because the only alternative route was around the Cape of Good Hope, which was much more expensive and time consuming. So guarding the Suez Canal and having a friendly settler state adjacent to it was extremely important to British imperialism. And thus, the establishment of a Jewish settler state was of prime importance. If I just read what the Balfour Declaration says, I mean, you'll see again, I mean, really the dishonesty, because the British were quite happy to see a Jewish state, but of course that wasn't mentioned. What the Balfour Declaration said was His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, which is a strange way of describing the vast majority of people, the Arab peoples of Palestine, or the rights and the political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. The latter phrase, of course, refers to the disquiet, to say the least, expressed by most Jews, that if there was a Jewish state in Palestine, then that would be an invitation to countries to get rid of their Jewish population on the grounds that there was a state already made for them and there was no need for them to stay any longer. And in fact, that is the main reason why anti-Semites have always supported Zionism, that the idea of a state where you can send your unwanted Jews to is particularly attractive to them. So this was the Balfour Declaration, but Balfour himself made his views quite clear later on when he said that Zionism being a far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. So, I mean, he was clear. I mean, Balfour was a notorious imperialist. He started off as chief secretary in Ireland, and he was known as Bloody Balfour after the police shot 3 demonstrators at Mitchelstown, Cork. I think it was about 1885. And he expressed himself in the House of Commons as believing that black people were inherently inferior in terms of intelligence and so on. A view which wasn't particularly popular even at that time when colonialism was in its heyday. So Balfour was a thoroughly reactionary fellow, which is why he is a hero to this day of the Zionist movement. He prefigured it in so many ways. And so the Balfour Declaration really gave way. It was approved by the League of Nations in 1922. It gave way to the Palestine Mandate, which existed from officially 1922-23, right up to 1948, when the State of Israel was declared. The British played their normal role. I mean, both dividing and ruling, setting Jew against Arab, but always mindful of their own interests. The Zionists fought bitterly to ensure that there was no democratic legislative assembly for Palestine as long as they were in a minority. Because the British, even in India and other colonies, would, under pressure, establish some form of legislative assembly. It didn't have sovereignty, of course, but it was, if you like, the beginnings of a kind of democratic control of those countries, and they turned into parliaments in due course. But the Zionists were implacably opposed to any self-government of Palestine as long as they were a settler minority. And we see continuous riots and conflicts between the Zionist settlers and the existing population. It should be said, I mean, the Zionists were about half the Jewish population in 1918, which was about 80,000. They were opposed by the existing Jewish communities in Palestine, which had become very integrated. And when Arab nationalism first reared its head in Palestine, and it can be said, I think, with a certain amount of justice, that the main element crystallizing Palestinian consciousness, because the Arabs up to that time would be divided into Bedouin, Circassian, and so on, because it was a feudal economy. I mean, the main element in crystallizing the Palestinian and Arab nationalist consciousness was unwittingly Zionism itself. I don't think there's any doubt, and that's true often of other British colonies as well. But in the first manifestations of Arab nationalism, they appealed to Muslims, Christians, and Jewish citizens, because Jews, for instance, in Jerusalem, by the mid-19th century, formed a majority of people. But because there'd been a tradition going back a few hundred years for Orthodox Jews to emigrate from Europe to Palestine, they were living on charity and they died there, but they had no political aspirations separate from the people around them. And Jerusalem itself was a complex web of different, a mosaic of different religious groups and peoples. But they got on particularly well until the Zionists, who made it clear from the start that they believed in Jewish supremacy. They were there to replace the Palestinian Arabs, not to work alongside them. The Zionist trade union, Histadrut, didn't accept Arab members. It had a separate Arab wing, but in practice, it amounted to nothing. So, I mean, the Zionists pursued from the start a policy of apartheid, and this led to riots in 1920-21, and again in 1929, a dispute over the Western Wall, the so-called last wall of the temple. We don't know whether that's true or not, but they were particularly vicious riots, and about 200-300 people died. And the British, as a result of that, commissioned a report, the Hope-Simpson Commission of Inquiry, the Hope-Simpson report. And I actually advise anyone who is interested in what was happening and the mechanics of alienation of the Palestinians and the Arabs to actually read that report, because it is extremely good. It lays out very clearly the hypocrisy of the Zionists, who talked about peace and goodwill to all men and women, but they were steadily displacing the Arabs from the economy as a precursor to displacing them from the country altogether. The commission, there was just one dissenting member, because it found in favor of what the Palestinians were saying, and that was a Labour Party member. So you might want to bear that in mind when you think about Keir Starmer today being a Zionist without qualification. So, I mean, that was the mandate, but the British enabled the Zionist militias to arm, and they trained them. And then in 1936-39 revolt, they formed the Jewish Settlement Police. The Haganah were given pride of place. And so really the British prepared the Zionist militias and enabled the Zionist militias to reach a strength such that they were able to carry out the Nakba in 1947 and 48. So I'll leave it at that. Say the Balfour Declaration was a pivotal document in the history of the British Empire and in Palestine in particular. And like most things, it was dishonest from the start. Thank you. I don't know how long I've been. About 20 minutes, is it?
25 minutes, but that was
Right.
that was fantastic. Thank you very much,
Sure.
Tony. Tom, do you want to just speak a little bit, and then we can
Sure.
ask you some questions? Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Yes. And thank you, Tony. Just to add a little bit to what Tony was saying about the Ottoman Empire, in my view, even more than in the past, given the genocide that's ongoing now, all history should be directed towards its use as a tool against what's happening now. So if I think of the Ottoman Empire, what comes to mind? It is one of the most desperate Zionist ploys that we hear more often these days, which is this idea that there was never a Palestinian state. Therefore, what's going on is in some way justified. Now, uh, this argument, first of all, above all, it depends on the idea of the nation state, this 19th century invention, as having been the gold standard by which people have the right to live on the land that they live on. It also assumes that the Hebrew lands of the Old Testament somehow were this nation state. But we hear this argument over and over again, and we need to point out when we hear this the absurdity of the argument, even on the historical scale, and much less on the moral scale, as though this had any bearing. Now, so we get to, as Tony spoke much about, the Balfour Declaration. I think, given the way that we today are being silenced with the reverse definition of anti-Semitism, I think it's important to start from the beginning and point out how anti-Semitism was exploited by the Zionists during the Balfour Declaration era. I'd like to read a couple of extracts from an Italian Jew who lived in Alexandria, who was influential on the minds of the Brits who were working with the British Zionists to write the Balfour Declaration. There was this idea that in 1916 or so, the British were not doing so well in the Great War, World War I. So the Zionists decided that they would exploit this British anti-Semitic idea of Jews as some great worldwide cabal that had this great power. So I will read to you a letter from Sir Edward Grey, who was the Foreign Secretary at the time before Balfour. It was clear that England had not, in the present struggle, World War I, the sympathy of the Jewish race, and he feared that the indifference or hostility of the Jewish race had been a deadweight against us during the past 18 months of the war, and would continue to retard every step we took towards victory. And went on to talk about how this Alexandrian Jew, whose name was Suarez, no relation, it's spelled differently, told him, in effect, all you have to do is sign on the line, all the Jews, this race, in the most anti-Semitic terminology, all you need to do was to give us Palestine, and we will enlist our forces to help you win the war. Now, it's hard to reconstruct today how much the British actually believed this, or that they used this also as a reason because they thought that the Zionists could, in effect, be the caretakers for their acquisition of Palestine in the future. But if you fast forward 20 years past the Balfour Declaration to the Peel Commission, which was formed to try to figure out how to sort out the catastrophe that had already evolved from the Balfour Declaration, down the line, Winston Churchill and all the other people who had had some part in the affairs of the time, they all said the same thing, that the reason they quote unquote gave Palestine to the Zionists was because they had made this deal with, as they put it, the Jews. So again, whether to believe that this was really the reason or a reason that they used, the fact is that they were affected by the Zionist use of anti-Semitic ideas at the time. So you come now to the Zionists beginning to occupy Palestine, and it's important to point out that although other places were considered, Uganda, Cyprus, the Sinai, these places were considered, they were never alternatives to Palestine. They were always stepping stones to Palestine if Palestine could not be gotten immediately. Now, the reason this is important is because once we get to the point where the Zionists have achieved some sort of political perceived legitimacy through the European support, then we confront Zionism as a marketing project, a huge marketing project through to this day. Now, it had to be Palestine. Why? Because they were selling a messianic product. And where could the idea of the Jews so-called going back to their biblical roots? Obviously, it had to be Palestine. And it had nothing to do with religion. Ben-Gurion himself states that they had to call the land, they had to call it either Israel, or funny enough, he also said it could be called Judea. Why? Because that was the only way, in his words, that they could get enough Jews to go there. It was a marketing project. And the use of Hebrew as the vernacular was also for the same reason. You couldn't have this theater of the or this reconstitution of the Hebrew lands and people speaking German or Ladino or Polish or Arabic or whatever. No, it had to be Hebrew. And this is why Hebrew was enforced by violence. There were actually mini pogroms against some of the settlers who they had gone to Palestine because that was the place to go to get away from the fascism in Europe, but they weren't particularly interested in this theater of the Zionists, and they were beat up. Their presses were blown up for speaking and writing in German. Now, when we get to the end of the mandate period, during which obviously the Palestinians, after two major uprisings, had decided, okay, they decided that the uprisings did not do any good. Let's see what happens if we do exactly what I don't mean to put what we're told, but that if we don't rebel, and if instead we go along with it, and that we should be rewarded for playing by the rules. So you have a period from roughly the beginning of World War II through to the early summer of 1947, whereby there was constant violence against the Palestinians, which we don't have recorded in the same detail that we have recorded violence against the British by the Zionists, or against Jews by the Zionists. And by the way, the principal victim of Zionist assassination, which is to say targeted killing rather than just victims of bombings, were Jews, not the British, not the Palestinians. The Palestinians were victims of obviously of market bombings and this sort of thing. But we know of just general terrorism against the Palestinians through British records, which simply state that it's still going on. They didn't bother to record it in the same detail they did it against the British, but it's always mentioned in passing, oh yes, a few more Palestinians were knifed on the Tel Aviv beach by the Zionists, and on. There were, for that several-year period, there was virtually no Palestinian blowback against this. And they even say that the British even point out that they are not, in so many words, taking the bait, that they know that if they fight back, that this would be used as an excuse by the Zionists to justify their actions. Fast forward today, and it's an exact explanation of what's happening. Every time the Palestinians defend themselves, it is turned around as a reason for the Israeli state to attack. Now, we get to the end of the mandate period, and the other thing that we hear constantly today is that the Palestinians declined the offer of a state. The Netanyahu's been saying that, and Alan Dershowitz said it just on an interview a few days ago, this idea that somehow this justifies what's going on today because Resolution 181, we are told, offered both the Zionists and the Palestinians a state. The Zionists accepted it with gratitude, and the Palestinians scoffed at it. Now, this above and beyond everything else should be exposed as an immoral explanation for what is happening today. But okay, let's, if this is going to be used as a reason, let's look at what actually happened, which is that the Zionists refuted Resolution 181 even more strongly than the Palestinians did, but they played a chess game. If you look through all the records of Zionist meetings from the immediate post-Balfour period all the way up to 1947, without fail, the Zionists planned from the beginning to take over the entire area and that it must be cleaned of as many non-Jews as possible. There is no exception to this except for some nice words spoken in public for public consumption. And it is explicit all the way from so-called moderates like Chaim Weizmann, who would become the first president, to mainstream figures that were supposed to be a bit more radical, like David Ben-Gurion. This was constant, that they would accept nothing less than at least river to sea, and hopefully more than that, cleansed of non-Jews. So it was clear by the time of the Peel Commission, 1937, it was pretty clear, even though the idea of partition that was proposed by the commission was never followed up, it was pretty clear that ultimately what would happen is the land would be partitioned. And this was known to be the case by the Zionists. By about 1944, the British were discussing that this was going to be their exit out of the catastrophe they had created. It was going to be a partition scam. And I say scam because it was known by the British. And shortly after that, after the death of FDR in 1945, shortly before the end of the Second World War, that when the Americans became more hands-on complicit with the Zionists, it was assumed that it was going to be partition, but it was also known that the Zionists would never abide by partition, and the whole thing was a scam. Now, the reason that the Zionists wanted partition is because it gave them statehood, and statehood was the key to everything. Even as early as years before that, when Weizmann met with Benito Mussolini, Weizmann actually already then referred to partition as the Archimedean fulcrum, the idea that if you put the fulcrum in the right place of a lever, you could lift anything. So with statehood, they could achieve everything else. Now, there was a reason why the UNSCOP, the UN committee that was tasked with finding a solution to the problem by the late 1940s, the reason why they selected partition as opposed to a binational single state, which was another idea they had. The reason they chose partition, in the words of the British, in documents not public at the time, was because they knew that if they had selected a single state, that there would be an increase in what they called Jewish terrorism that they would not be able to control, which of course was a reference to the Zionist terrorism that had already brought Palestine to its knees, and that 100,000 British soldiers had been unable to control. So that is the fear of Zionist terrorism, which at the time was increasingly threatening not just Palestine, but also Europe and Britain. Their fear of that was why they selected partition. And they knew that the Zionists wanted partition because it gave them the prize of statehood. Now, interestingly, once they selected partition as the answer, they had to draw the line. So it's curious that although the settlers were still a minority, that partition, Resolution 181, gave the Zionists about 55% of the land. Now, why did they do that? The reason they did that proves that the UN and everybody involved, the British and principally and the United States, knew as a fact beforehand that the Zionists were going to disregard partition anyway. And the proof of that is, again, in British records, why they drew the line the way they did. And the reason is because they knew that the Zionists would ignore it, but they thought by that giving them so much in front that they would delay, not prevent, but delay the first Zionist war of expansion. Now, above all, the Palestinians knew this. They weren't stupid. They knew what was going to happen. And this is why they refused to go along with the scam. They, by the way, proposed, they counter-offered with a plan which would be based on the system of the United States, a constitutional system, which obviously the Zionists were not interested in. Everything that happened has happened since then has been along the same lines. After the establishment of the Israeli state, you have the refugees in the West Bank and the people who were already living in what became the West Bank, then their lives also upended because of the upheaval and the refugees. And it's important at this point, especially considering what's going on, to always bring out the fact that the refugees are refugees not for the reasons that people who are unable to go home because of a natural disaster or ongoing conflict. No, the reason why there are millions of people who wake up every morning to the squalor of refugee camps is because Israel blocks their return. It's not for any other reason. So it's important always to point out with the genocide going on in Gaza now, to point out that most of the people in Gaza have homes. Those homes are now in the area under Israeli control. And the only reason they are not there is because Israel blocks them. Now, imagine the situation today reversed, where some Arab tribes who lived elsewhere decided that that their holy book gave them the land of Palestine, which at the time was populated by European Jews. Imagine everything reversed, and what would be going on today? If any of us were barred from going to our homes tonight because some foreign country blocked us, this is simply a continuation of what happened in 1948, and I think must always be brought out today because of what is happening.
Brilliant. Thank you both very much. Fantastic introductions, really important introductions that explain what's going on and why the situation is so important. Comrades, if you have an understanding is so important of the history, if you have any questions or contributions, please click raise hand and I can bring you in. I've got a couple of questions for you both to get the ball rolling. First to you, Tom, when you listen to Tony, do you agree with his assessment that the control of the Suez Canal was really of utmost importance and explains why Britain was so keen on having an outpost there, if you want to call it that? Is that the Suez Canal mainly, in your estimation?
I think the Suez Canal, yes, was certainly part of this, and it's certainly then ultimately played into the Suez crisis, was the control of that area. Tony knows more about that than I do, but yes, I certainly agree that that was part of it.
And then a question to you both. I mean, without Britain, I mean, and you described, not just the mandate period or the Balfour Declaration, etc., against opposition as well. Without Britain and its empire at the time and its strategic interests, etc., would there be an Israel? Would another country have pushed quite so hard without Britain doing it?
That brings up the whole question, which I have never been able to answer, and I've never heard a convincing answer, as to why the degree of Western, and especially my native country, the United States, I'm embarrassed to say, the degree of fealty to Israel. One can understand, of course, there's the pied-à-terre in the Middle East, there's the arms industry, there's maybe oil, even though there's no oil in Israel proper, but control of the area. You add all these things up, you add up all the Christian Zionists, the United States, and you add in AIPAC, all this stuff. To me, it still falls short of explaining why we are so beholden to this thing over there. I can't explain it, but certainly the interest in the area is playing out in strange ways today. Tony, what do you think?
Sorry, I wasn't following. Tell me again. What was the main question?
Looking at the world today, why is the United States, okay, Germany is, it looks like Germany is a special case because they are supposed to somehow redress their history of racial nationalism, which they're doing by supporting someone else's racial nationalism. Explain that one. But why the extent where, forgetting the German case, where the United States is destroying itself, it's selling its whatever moral soul it once had, it has sold. It's selling itself financially. It's making a complete farce of its alleged narrative for the sake of this Israeli state. Why?
Well, I think the reason is, firstly, the human rights narrative of the United States, the fight for democracy and so on and so on, has always been paper thin. I mean, we only have to look back to Pinochet, the Argentinian junta, the invasion of Iraq. I mean, the Indonesian slaughter. I mean, it's always been a fiction, but today it's even more of a fiction. The reason is that foreign policy is conducted on the basis of interests, economic primarily and political. And Israel, I mean, as Alexander Haig, Reagan's Secretary of State, said, is cheap at the price. It's a stable settler state in a region where there is a lot of instability and turmoil. And, I mean, if you employ an attack dog, you don't want to kick it too much because otherwise it may rebound. So, I mean, Israel has to be supported, come what may, whatever it does. I mean, and I sometimes ask myself, is there anything that Israel could do that the United States would disown? And I'm not sure there is an answer short of killing all the firstborn Palestinians. And even then, they'd probably say, well, they should be grateful not that it was only the firstborn. So I'm really not sure that the United States could ever live up to its rhetoric, because Israel is a part of its presence. It's the Suez Canal, it's the oil interest, but also the geopolitical interests in that area demand that if Israel goes, because Israel has successfully intimidated the Arab regimes into coming to terms with it. And of course, it protects them against their own people if it comes to that. Israel is important. The Jordanian king wouldn't be on the throne now, but for Israel, for example. I mean, Netanyahu virtually wept tears when Hosni Mubarak in Egypt was overthrown. So I don't think there's anything too surprising about the United States position today.
It seems to me, okay, we're gonna buy our access over there. Okay, what's the price? How much is it going to cost? I don't just mean financially, but in all the things that we sacrifice for this state. It seems to me that we could get everything that you're saying we want from Israel for a much better price. It seems that there seems to be no end to this. And much of the turmoil that you refer to is a result of our propping up this state over there.
Well, I'm not sure that's true, because imagine there was no Israel. So there was no enemy to focus on. And remember that Palestine is a symbol for revolt in all of the Arab East. It represents, if you like, the symbol of colonial penetration in the Arab East and what's been done to the Arab peoples. Remove Israel, and the Arab regimes have to face their own people much more directly. And I think that is one reason. But you know, imperialism is not logical. If you did a cost-benefit analysis, you may be right. But we know that a never-increasing proportion of the US budget is spent on its military. Logically, that makes no sense, but that's what they do. And of course, that means the arms companies profit, and they are important politically. So supporting Israel means you increase and ramp up your arms expenditure. I mean, there are all sorts of benefits for imperialism.
I still don't see that as if you take something like the crime of the U.S. Overthrow in Chile and the installation of Pinochet. Okay, now this was a crime, but it was done, and then the rest was the fallout from it. Or even the Iraq War, once you invaded, then you own the war. To me, Israel is different is because it's ongoing and there is no end to it. For example, take the genocide in Gaza now. I don't see that we have any benefit by the United States interests get any benefit out of more genocide rather than less genocide.
No, there is no benefit. I mean, I'm sure Joe Biden would be much happier if there was no genocide. But
it's in his hands.
Well, it's in his hands. But given the choice between dissociating himself from Israel or opposing, have I got it the right way around? Given the choice between dissociating himself from the genocide or supporting Israel, then he supports Israel come what may, and not just Biden. I mean, the whole of the Republican Party and virtually all the Democrats. I mean, it is a wall-to-wall coalition of the American ruling class with very, very few exceptions. And so how do we explain the main lobby in favor of Israel and Zionism in the US is not a Jewish lobby, as some people imagine. It's a Christian, and the Christian Zionists really are just a religious representation of US imperialism. I mean, they justify everything, wherever it is, in terms of God, because God is always on our side. Why do they do it in Israel? Because it's an incredibly important region to have a stable settler state, which all but finances itself, which is the hammer, in essence, of revolution anywhere in that region. I think it's cheap at the price, honestly. Yeah. The only way Israel is going to be threatened in terms of the US relationship is if the Arab regimes themselves are threatened. In other words, revolution in the Arab East is as important as what happens in Palestine eventually if we want to see an end to Zionism.
We have a few comrades now with their hands up, so I think it's also important to understand that, of course, Britain had other interests in 1917 when it issued the Balfour Declaration in Israel than now America has. But it's important to understand where that history comes from. Tom, did you want to say something before I bring in some people with some questions?
No, I'm still not convinced that there's something else going on. I'm still not convinced that you add all this up and it explains the bizarre behavior of the United States.
I don't think it's bizarre. I mean,
No.
I think it's of a piece with everything else. That's the difference. I should add that at the time of the Balfour Declaration, for many years to come, certainly the better part of a decade, the British ruling class was divided over the wisdom of the Zionist enterprise. The Daily Mail and Daily Express were opposed. I think the House of Lords actually passed a motion opposing the Balfour Declaration at one point. Yeah, so there was a long debate. And actually, the military were less in favour of the Balfour Declaration, and the political wing, Churchill in particular, were in favour. So there was that debate had out within the British ruling class before eventually they settled on Zionism as their established.
Why did they oppose it, Tony?
Oh, we're wasting more money on these Jewish settlers. Why are we throwing good money after bad? Because they always weighed up the costs of empire. They didn't see the benefits would be long term, whereas Churchill was far more farsighted in that respect, and Lloyd George was as well.
Interesting. Okay, Ian, would you like to come in and ask a question or make a comment?
Really just to ask a question. Given that Britain had played a huge role in effectively training and arming the Haganah, and indeed the Irgun, I suppose, one removed. I was reading in Ilan Pape's book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine today, that the Soviet Union also provided armaments for Zionist settlers in 1947-48. Could you explain a little bit around that? And although I think I know the answer to this one, could you again bring out a little bit of the after all, the Nakba happened on Labour's watch. This tension it seems to have existed in the Labour Party to ensure the Zionist settlement went ahead. Thank you.
The Labour, by the way, Labour Party actually proposed the transfer of non-Jews out of Palestine on behalf of the Zionists. And yes, the Zionists, there was a major purchase of Russian arms. I believe it was by way of Czechoslovakia in 47, aside from a lot of...
Free Palestine, bro. Shut up, bro.
Sorry.
Communism is the way, bro.
Okay, sorry, somebody... Sorry, carry on, Tom. I don't know who did that.
Aside from many shipments from Britain and especially the United States, illegal shipments secretly going over to the Zionists. And of course, one of the reasons why we decided to get rid of Nasser was because he, in frustration, went also to Russia to get arms, and where it was okay for the Zionists to do it, it was not okay for the Egyptians to do it. Tony, do you have anything to...
Well, Stalin's foreign policy was always very short-sighted and counterproductive, and of course he prioritized the interests of the Soviet Union, socialism in one country over revolution outside. I mean, that was the main thrust, and it was usually a reactionary policy. And Stalin's calculation was that supporting the Zionists would get rid of British imperialism from the Middle East, not realizing, of course, that American imperialism was ready and set to take its place. And of course, after Suez, Eisenhower put the British in their place, and the French too, when in essence he caused a run on the pound, and Britain had to very quickly withdraw. So that was a narrow calculation. In fact, it could be argued that without the Czechoslovak arms and the air the aeroplanes and so on, they supplied them, the Zionists might not have won the battle. So, I mean, it was incredibly important and incredibly stupid. And what it did was undermine the support for the communist parties, which were strong in places like Iraq and Egypt and Syria. So, you know, but then again, I mean, Stalin didn't care because he didn't care about revolution anywhere else either. So that was the Soviet Union's calculation. The Zionist calculation, of course, was a mirror image of that. They wanted to replace British imperialism and switch sides to the American imperialism. The Biltmore Conference in 1942 was, if you like, where that decision was effectively taken. And that was the reason for the dispute between Chaim Weizmann and Ben-Gurion, because, I mean, Weizmann actually left the presidency for 3 years, I think, of the Zionist organization as a result of the bitter disputes between those two Zionist leaders.
Was that your answer, your question answered, Ian?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Malcolm, I think you want to just ask a question or not come in.
First of all, people should read the books written by both our speakers. They're both incredibly informative. But one of the things I'd like to ask, which is outlined in their books over and over again, is how the sort of ruthless violence of Zionism is not well known. I mean, why is it? It's sort of in I call it popular press, but I mean, people don't. I mean, it's pointed out by both Tony and Tom in their books, have the similarities between Zionism and the Nazis. But I mean, that's not a narrative, is it, in the media at all, as far as I know. Thank you.
Well, that's one of the reasons that the IHRA pseudo definition specifically forbids the analogy between Nazism and Zionism, because that would be obviously a fatal flaw for Zionism. I have to say that I've always resisted the comparison, not because there are not valid points to it, but because it seems to me that we shouldn't need to invoke European suffering in order to explain non-European suffering, that we should look at what's happening to the Palestinians, and it in of itself should show us what's happening. We shouldn't need to compare it to European suffering. But certainly with what's going on today, I think the comparison should be invoked because we need to wake up the public of the one country that can stop this, the United States. And why the history of Zionist terrorism during the pre-state years, and of course after statehood, the same thing, is not better known, because there's, for the same reason that if you go to the New York Times, or slightly less egregious, the BBC World News, you get a sanitized version of what's happening. But to me, one of the principal reasons why the Zionists fought so bitterly to prevent a Palestinian state, it wasn't just land. It was also because statehood has its own privileged language. Once the Israeli state self-declared itself, what had been its terrorism now became the actions of a sovereign state. They became military actions. We think of Deir Yassin as this great act of terrorism, which it was, but there were atrocities after that which were even worse, but we don't think of them in the same way because it was done by a state. And for the same reason, Palestinian resistance is now called terrorism, simply because they do not speak from the podium of statehood.
Tony, do you want to say something?
Well, yeah, I mean, the simple answer is that imperialism never concentrates on its own violence. You know, I mean, we watched Westerns when I was younger, and you never saw the Indians being exterminated. What you saw was the Indians attacking for no good reason at all the cowboys who circled their wagons. The same in India. The Black Hole of Calcutta was remembered, but not blowing Indians from the cannons of British guns. Uh, the same with Israel. I mean, although they can't prevent the violence being shown, you'll see in the statements of politicians, they prioritize the attack on October the 7th and not the violence that the Israeli state has pursued since then. And of course, there's no mention at all of the violence against Gaza before October the 7th, which puts it into context. So that is how imperialism operates. It is very, very selective in what it shows. And that's the very nature. It's rooted in imperialism, that imperialism doesn't consider its own violence to be anything to worry about. I mean, America's invasion of Iraq, did we see all the many, many atrocities that the Americans committed? Of course not. And Julian Assange is paying the price because he did expose some of them. So I think this is just how it operates. Of course, Israel is having a problem with the violence it is perpetrating, which is why it's doing its best either to exclude journalists from Gaza or to kill them while they're there, so they can't report. A couple of points. Firstly, a good book to read, although it's dated, it's still, I think, quite valid, is Leonard Steen's The Balfour Declaration. It is very, very thorough, and I do recommend people to it. As regards the Nazis, I mean, I think comparisons are valid. Obviously, the comparisons aren't particularly apposite after 1941, when the Holocaust began. But it is worth bearing in mind that in Israel today, there is an exterminationist mentality towards the Palestinians, and many people actually do talk of that openly. So the mindset of the Nazis is certainly present in Zionism, and they are quite similar projects in certain ways. They both were ethno-nationalist states, for example, and we know the Nazis turned to the Holocaust when expulsion was no longer possible of the Jews. And what we're seeing today is a precursor of much the same phenomena in Gaza. I don't think we should be under any doubt that however many are killed, it's not enough for major elements of Zionism, represented by people like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich in the Israeli cabinet, who openly talk about killing thousands. So, I mean,
and of course, I mean, we should say, I mean, the Israeli state has not, set up gas chambers, etc., to kill Palestinians. But
no,
it uses the Holocaust, doesn't it? It uses the Holocaust as an excuse to commit its own genocide, and that's why I think actually any comparisons should be allowed, because if you misuse that tragedy to create your own genocide on people, then you have to be able to stand
this is another aspect where I think history can help us now, and this is something that Tony specializes on, is the fact that during the darkest days of European Jewry, Zionism was not their friends. No, Zionism worked against the safety, salvation, dignity of European Jews when they most needed it. So it's grotesquely ironic now that the Zionists always invoke the history of European anti-Semitism and a Holocaust as that they are the torchbearer of the moral weight of this, when no, it was the opposite. And of course, Tony's book should be read for anyone interested in that subject.
I did put both titles of your books in the emails advertising this, but I should say thing as well. So Thomas has written a book called Palestine Hijacked: How Zionism Forged an Apartheid State from River to Sea, amongst other things you've written. And Tony Greenstein's book is called Zionism During the Holocaust. We have now a question from a 10-year-old viewer. Very much looking forward to that one. Hello, Conrad.
Hello.
Hi.
So recently there's been some bombing in Palestine and Israel by both sides. Just wondering about so there's been quite a few deaths.
A lot of deaths.
Yeah. And
what is the situation? What is going to happen?
What's going to happen now with it all?
That's a good question. Thank you. Tom, do you want to start?
Thank you, Tony. And I hope you're okay, Tony. I hope you, and he can give you his pocket money if you need some money.
No, I mean, that's okay. And thank you for your well wishes, and thank you for everyone. I mean, these are difficult times where freedom of speech is under attack by the state. So we have to bear that in mind. Thank you. I don't know your name.
Augustus.
Oh, right. That's a famous Roman emperor, I believe. What is going to happen? Well, I don't have a crystal ball. That's the first thing. So, and I'm not that good at predicting the future, unlike Nostradamus. But having said that, I know what the Zionist movement, the Israeli government, and the majority of the Israeli people, the Israeli Jewish people want, and that is to ethnically cleanse Gaza of the Palestinians, to empty it, and to pour them into Egypt and create a further refugee problem. Whether they get away with that, I do not know, but that is the meaning of a food and water and fuel blockade. It is to drive them out of Gaza. Yeah.
Tom, how do you think the situation is going to develop? I mean, both Biden and the EU are now talking about sustainable ceasefires, etc. Is that coming anytime soon, you think?
I, of course, agree with Tony that what Israel wants is to use this as an excuse to ethnically cleanse the people in Gaza into the Sinai and then annex Gaza. Now, it's hard to imagine them getting away with that, but of course we've said that before when we're proven wrong and they do get away with what we thought was impossible. But I do think that because of the significant blowback around the world, that they won't get away with that this time. The question then becomes, who will govern Gaza? The Israelis are, of course, adamant that certainly not Hamas, but not even Fatah in the West Bank will govern, which is a bit odd to me because Fatah is really just a Vichy government for Israel at this point. But they will also be against any UN supervision of the Gaza Strip. So I don't know how it's going to play out. I'm sorry, Augustus, is that the name?
Augustus.
Yeah. What do you think?
What do you think?
Well, I think that hopefully it should clear up and everyone should get back to their daily lives and everyone get back and live happily with their families.
And why do you think that doesn't happen?
Mainly because greed and wealth.
I see.
People salvage money and try and get as much as possible. Let's say, for example, Coca-Cola, all these brands really adding money against Palestine.
Okay.
He's my grandson, you realize. I'm a good grandson.
Very good. Thanks, Augustus. Thank you. Youngest person who I had on the program, so thank you for that. Peter Kahn, please.
Thank you. A while ago, I went on a visit to Belfast, visited the Catholic streets, familiar to many of us, but also to the Protestant streets, and I came across a mural dedicated to Colonel Patterson. And I'd never heard of him. but it explained on this mural about how he had basically helped to create a Jewish unit within the British Army, and was later described as the father of the Israeli army, and became friends of the Netanyahu family, and was a big influence. Well, it seems to be an influence on American thinking as well as British ruling class thinking. I'm surprised that in all the discussions and debates I've heard over recently, his name has never been mentioned. I just wonder whether Tony and Tom could shed some light on him. Thank you.
Was he involved in the formation of the Jewish Brigade in 1944 or something? I'm trying to figure out what this was that he was involved with.
I'm sorry. Yes, it would have been First World War and just after.
Oh, so First World War. Okay, there were two. There was during the First World War, there was an attempt at this. It was called the Jewish Legion, which never quite got off the ground. But then towards the end of the Second World War, the Zionists were working towards an exclusively Jewish unit, which became the Jewish Brigade, against the wishes of and the advice of the military people. It was a political decision. That's again. Do you have a better idea of the year involved with this?
Sorry, you're muted. Tony, do you know anything more about this?
Okay.
Can I speak?
Yes, you can.
Okay. Yeah, I don't have a detailed history, but I know he was an officer in the First World War and helped to establish this unit. And in the post-war period, he was influential in arming Zionists. I mean, I find it interesting that we talk about the Balfour Declaration and the machinations of within the ruling class, British ruling class, but at the same time, there are people with guns that are arming the Zionists. So it wasn't just pieces of paper, it was violence.
Okay, thank you for that.
I've never heard of this Colonel Patterson, I have to confess. There was another colonel, I think that was his rank, Minor Hartsgen in the First World War, who certainly was influential. I suspect that someone, I presume it must have been in the Shankill Road, not the Falls Road, has dug out a bit of history. Whether he was as influential as is made out, I have my doubts. The most influential pro-Zionist British officer, and the British Army initially was pretty hostile to the Zionist enterprise. They thought it would get in their way, was Major Lord Wingate, who died in Burma, I think in 1944 with the Chindits. He was a Christian Zionist. He trained them in the counterinsurgency between 1936 and 39 with the Palmach, who became in essence the equivalent of the SAS. They were the left of the kibbutzim movement, incidentally. So people, when we use left and right for Zionism, these are very different terms from the ones we ourselves should understand. The left was the most militaristic in many ways. So you need to bear that in mind. But unfortunately about this Patterson guy, I'll do a Google search after the program, but I know nothing about him. I'm sorry.
Jane, please.
It's actually Toby Absey, but he's using my Zoom link. I switch it round. Hope you will see. Okay.
Okay. To some extent, what I was going to say was raised by Ian earlier, and Tony actually agreed that the role of it was the role of the Soviet Union and the arms that had came via Czechoslovakia, which played the biggest role, I thought, in the 48 war, and I think Tony is agreeing with that.
Yeah.
Therefore, what I was seeking to do was, whilst I'm not in any way disagreeing with the notion that from 1967 onwards, that there is this intensely close link between American imperialism and the State of Israel. And I was also aware that in the 50s, it was French imperialism that was the sponsor of the State of Israel, which leads up to Suez more than the Brits. All I was doing was seeking to do was to question the notion that British imperialism had consistently supported the Zionists. Yeah, I mean, it did off and on, but I would have thought in 48, Glubb Pasha, for example, and there were other people who were British with the Arab armies in 48, and as Tony said, it was the USSR which was backing the Zionists and arming them via Czechoslovakia. So I was just commenting a bit on what I felt was a slight oversimplification there. And I suppose I don't want to sound that I'm justifying Stalin too much, but you know, the Arab regimes of the time were pretty reactionary. We're talking about a period before people like Nasser, and they were under the influence of British imperialism. And I would therefore give critical support in a way to what Stalin was doing. I'm not justifying the Nakba. I'm not justifying Deir Yassin or anything like that. But I mean, there's also the question of the Brits were actually stopping Jews going to Palestine around that time. They were also stopping them going to Britain as well, while they were quite willing to admit every Ukrainian, Latvian war criminal they could to Britain in the period between 45 and 48, when they were keeping Jews out of both Britain. I mean, I'm talking about the people in the deep, you know, the displaced people, the people, survivors of the Holocaust who were in mainland Europe, were being kept out of Britain at that point. So the British attitude is a bit more ambivalent than I think some of the things earlier were saying. Look, I'm not disputing what you're talking about, either of you talking about now. I mean, there is a Palestinian child being killed every 10 minutes because of the American arms that are going to the Israelis and have been going to the Israelis for 75 days. And I think this is typical of US foreign policy. It's not just to do with Israel. I mean, if you think of the seas of blood in Indonesia in 65, and if you think of the hundreds of thousands who died in Iraq and what they did in Afghanistan and all the rest of it, which Assange, you know, is probably going to be put in life confinement in the US for having dared reveal that. I mean, the US policy is pretty murderous. I mean, I do think they're the worst of the imperialist powers. Their record all over the place is terrible. I could go on about Italy and all the things they did, backing a neo-fascist terrorism consistently. But I'll shut up there. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, Tom, what do you want me to?
Go on.
Yes, I mean, there was a time. Look, in all settler states, you find that at a certain period of time, the settlers rebel against the mother country or the sponsoring power. That happened in South Africa. There were 2 Boer Wars, don't forget. But despite that, after the Boer Wars, Britain, in essence, supported apartheid under first Smuts and then, of course, Milan. The same in Palestine. There were conflicts with the British. I mean, the main conflict was from 1945 onwards, when the Haganah and the Irgun were fighting to evict the British. There's no doubt about it. It was a war between them. But nonetheless, Britain knew that it could not arm or support the Palestinians. And so, if you like, it retreated rather than conduct that fight, given the pressure it was under from America. But what can one say? Of course, you're right about America. I mean, I've said it myself, that the United States will spill any amount of blood. But even during the Labour government, which was, if you like, Bevan was pretty hostile, to the Zionist enterprise as a result. But there were important figures within the Labour Party and the Labour government and the Labour Parliamentary Party, Richard Crossman, Lasky, and so on, who basically supported the Zionist terrorists. They had no compunction in doing so. So much for patriotism. And Israel itself, although Stalin believed that he could evict the British, at no point did the Israeli government therefore support Stalinism. Ben-Gurion was a fervent anti-communist. Indeed, the reason in the 1949, the first elections to the Knesset, polls, Mapai gained 46 seats out of 120. Mapam gained 19 with what was called Achdut Avodah. Together, they had an overall majority in the Knesset. But because Mapam was pro-Soviet at that time, Ben-Gurion preferred to form an alliance with the General Zionists and what became the National Religious Party. So from its very outset, Israel was anti-communist. The Labour Zionists were prime amongst them. Mapam at that time was more pro-Soviet, though it later also followed an anti-communist path.
Interesting. Do you have anything else on that, Tom?
No, nothing to add to that. Thank you.
We've got a few people now. Comrades, if you could keep your comments or contributions quite short. Thank you. Satish. Hiya. Sorry, you need to unmute. Can you see it? I'll bring somebody else quickly in and then see if you can find it. Yeah. Cheryl, please.
There he is.
Oh, you got it. Have you got it, Satish?
Yes, I've
Okay,
got
yeah,
myself
go on
on.
then. Yeah.
But Cheryl
Hi.
can go first if you want
No,
to.
it's all right. You go ahead now.
Well, my question was in relation to the Ottoman Empire, in that I'd like to know what you both think about during the early days, well, I say early days, more towards the end of the Ottoman Empire. How important was that, or what they tried to do in terms of supporting the development of Palestinian resistance and Arab resistance? And now that the Ottoman Empire is obviously consigned to history, how important is Turkey in this struggle?
I suggest I take another one question and then we can answer that together, if that's okay. Cheryl now, if you would like to come. Cheryl?
Yep.
Yep, there you are. We can't see you. There you are. Hi.
Sorry about that. In relation to the point Tom was making earlier about American imperialism, I was on a Twitter space the other day with this lady called Layla Hatoum. I'll post her name in the chat box. Who was a Lebanese academic, and she has this. She gave a very interesting and very complicated answer to my question in relation to America's interest in supporting the Israelis. I'll put it in the chat anyway. It's called The Real Reason Behind the Levantine War. Yeah. Oh yeah, so my question, sorry, getting to my question. I thought, Tony, you were a bit harsh in saying that all Israelis have got an exterminist ideology. Is that not? I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure all Israelis are of that mindset. But my question is really about the origins of Zionism and how Israel is today, because it kind of presents itself as being a democracy. And if you listen, I listened to this short video by Gideon Levy, who was saying, Israel has a veneer of democracy. However, Arabs now can vote, on the face of it, they have equal rights. And so in what way would you define it as an apartheid state? When I defined it the other day to a colleague of mine that it was an apartheid state, she was saying, well, no, it's not. I mean, Arabs can marry Jewish people, Arabs can vote in Israel. And I know there is deep racism. This is what Gideon Levy was saying, you know, it's the veneer of democracy. You know, there is deep racism against the Arabs. However, you know, the rule of law is equal. You know, they can stand in the Knesset and they can, you know, there is already a Palestinian Arab who is in the Knesset, etc. And I suppose I'm saying, I know Tom was saying that, you know, that Palestinians can't go back. You know, you're saying they're blocked from going back. I assume you mean they're blocked from going back to land that was stolen from them. So I suppose, and being a lawyer, I'm not an international lawyer, I'm kind of thinking, well, what does define apartheid? What, you know, Arabs, for example, can work in the labor market now, can't they, in Israel? So what, although maybe the origins were that the Arabs couldn't work, is it? Yeah. So anyway, yeah.
First of all, if we ask what is the Israeli state? Now, you talk about people getting married. No, actually, by Israeli law in Israel, someone who the state considers to be Jewish cannot marry someone who the state considers not to be Jewish. There is this idea of a purity of blood. And as far as democracy goes, no, non-Jews within the Israeli state don't have the same rights. And if you extend that to East Jerusalem, which Israel considers to be as much a part of Israel as any other part, it claims to have annexed it, non-Jews in East Jerusalem are not even citizens, they're residents. But the larger question is, whose lives does the Israeli state control? Not just the land that we consider to be Israeli, but it controls the lives of everybody in the West Bank. The Palestinian Authority is just a chimera, is just a shingle on a door in Ramallah. It controls the lives of every refugee, everybody in a refugee camp, which I think that we do them a disservice to call them just refugee camps. All those people, their lives are directly controlled by Israel. They have no vote. The non-Jews in the West Bank have no vote. The people in Gaza, needless to say, have no vote. This is not a democracy, even by the most rudimentary definition of Hulkum Pula Lever. This whole idea of Israel as a democracy is so easy to debunk. It is nothing of the sort. And
I suppose sorry, Tom, I wasn't referring to the West Bank or Gaza. I was actually referring to 1948. I mean, the Arabs can have citizenship in Israel.
But no, listen to what you're saying. Imagine if we started saying
no, I mean West, legally.
Well, black people can have citizenship. Imagine if we spoke like this.
No, I suppose I'm saying, you know, Britain is a very racist state where black people are, you know, there's institutional racism, and I'm saying, what defines it as an apartheid state? I mean, I heard, you know, recently that somebody had applied for citizenship because Netanyahu is so corrupt that he could see ways that he could benefit from it. He was an Arab Palestinian. So I suppose I'm saying, you know, what is it?
No, you
I'm
Let them answer now, Sharon.
Yeah,
come on.
Sorry.
I mean, do you want me to explain? If you're going to define apartheid, I think it's probably a state of institutionalized racial supremacy. Israel, there is one regime which controls the whole of Greater Israel, which is basically the existing Mandate Palestine. It may have different administrative regimes within it for the West Bank and for Gaza, but it controls the whole of Palestine. half the people have a vote, half the people don't have a vote. So even on Israel's own definition, it can't be democratic. In the West Bank, and of course Gaza by default, there are two legal regimes, one for Jewish settlers and another for non-Jewish Palestinians. That is the quintessential definition of apartheid. Inside Israel itself, there are about 60 laws which discriminate against Palestinians. Citizenship is not equal. Citizenship in Israel is virtually meaningless. Normally, you're a national of a country and therefore you're a citizen of that country. The two are coterminous. In Israel, that's not the case. There are about 130 nationalities, but being a Jewish state, there is only one nationality that is important, and that is Jewish nationality. So you look, for instance, at the behavior of the police, who operate according to the law. The police do not open fire ever on demonstrations of Jews, even when they turn violent, massive demonstrations against judicial reforms. The police didn't open fire. But for Palestinian and non-Jewish, the refugee demonstration recently by Eritreans, they have no hesitation in open fire and killing demonstrators. I mean, I'll give you one example of a discrimination. The Reception Committee's law of 2011. There was a decision in the Supreme Court that the Jewish National Fund and the Israeli Land Authority could not refuse to sell someone a piece of property because they were not Jewish. That's what they were doing up to then. So what did the Knesset do? And by a large majority, it passed a law which enabled the mission committees to refuse membership to people on social and cultural grounds. It didn't specify Arabs, but everyone understood what they meant. The law return, of course, which is the basic fundamental law of Israel, grants me the right to go to Israel and claim citizenship and nationality, although I've only been there once and I have no desire to live there because I'm Jewish. But a Palestinian friends of mine cannot do that even if they're born there. And the whole idea of a Jewish ethnic state is that it is inherently racist. It cannot be anything other. The difference with, say, Britain, which is nominally a Christian state, is it's not a Christian ethno-state. Where there were ethnic Christian states in Europe in the 1930s and 40s, Romania, Slovakia, Croatia, Hungary, and so on, they were the most avid pursuers of the Holocaust of any states. In many ways, they outdid the Nazis. I mean, the Governor Hans Frank, the Nazi governor of Poland, said about the Romanians that we practice the art of surgery, they practice butchery. That is inevitable in an ethnic state based on religion. In Britain, do my rights differ from someone who's Christian because I'm not Christian? No, of course not. The Queen or the King is the head of the Christian church, but there are no rights that pertain to someone who's not Jewish that apply to people who are Jewish. That is a difference, and that is why Israel is an apartheid state.
There's, of course, a difference in a sense of the apartheid of South Africa, which exploited the Black population, whereas the Palestinian population is not exploited. It is, there's a genocide going on. It is an ethnic cleansing. It's segregation, isn't it? It's a segregated society.
Israel is far, far worse than South Africa. South Africa never bombed the shanty towns from the air. Israel regularly bombs the refugee camps. There really is no comparison at all. And incidentally, I forgot to mention to Cheryl, I don't say all Israelis are exterminationists. I say there is a growing exterminationist mood in Israel. And that, I think, is important to understand.
What about Satish's question? And I shouldn't have...
on Turkey.
And Arab resistance.
I confess I don't know a great deal about Turkey today, certainly. I mean, Erdogan is an opportunist. I mean, he does to the Kurds very much what Israel does to the Palestinians. I mean, he is a hypocrite and a dictator. The Ottoman Empire, I mean, was an empire which oppressed the Arab peoples of the time, and that's why they formed an alliance with Britain, but it didn't do them much good in the long term. So what can you say? It's it committed a genocide of its own with the Armenians. So there's not much to write home about it, really.
With the Ottoman Empire, I also think it's always good to remember that it was never a stable occupation. There were always nationalist movements within the river to sea, and some of these nationalist movements were fighting each other. And there was also Egypt, which would occasionally try to get control of the historic Palestine, not just for its own sake, but because it needed it as a conduit to things coming from north of there. So you fast forward today, and as far as Turkey today, I completely agree with Tony. Erdogan is a complete opportunist, and he is no friend of the Palestinians except when it suits him politically.
There's a lot of people talk about a sort of axis of resistance as well, which includes Iran, etc. But it is not necessarily an axis that's a friend of the working class, or our focus. Okay, the last question or comment is from Steve Freeman. Hi.
Hi, thanks, Tina, and thank you, Tom, for the talk, and also obviously for Tony, and solidarity, Tony. Now the Crown has managed to arrest you, and under all the powers that the Crown has got, of course, to take you into custody and all the rest of it. So let us just go back to, in many ways, in the darkest hour, it's very difficult to see any light. It's very difficult to think what any solution could possibly be when things are so horrific and so terrible. But nevertheless, we have to keep looking for the light, even in this darkest point. And I guess there are two kinds of solutions that people come up with. One is a democratic solution, and I'll come to that in a second. And the other one, I think, is where people say, well, under socialism, all these problems will have gone away. What we really need is socialism, and that will provide us with a solution. But I want to press on the democratic argument. And by that, I mean that you have to have a democratic aim, and you have to have a democratic means. By democratic means, I mean a position that is supported by the majority of Palestinians and the majority of Israelis. Now, that might seem absolutely impossible at this moment in time, but I want to wind the clock back to 1947, therefore, just to see where that went. Because in 1947, when the United Nations discussed this, there were three positions. One was partition, supported by, as you've already outlined, America, USSR, and the UK. There was another position, one Palestine, which was the Arab position, and then some people supported a binational state, and that was supported by Yugoslavia, India, and I think Iran. And I think it's in there where the argument has to. I think we have to go back to those points. Now, what happened to those positions? Well, partition has now become two states, because the two-state solution is only really partition by another name. It's kind of completing the partition. And many of us agree, and I know you do, Tony, that the two-state solution, the continuation of partition, is not the answer. It doesn't provide a democratic answer, so we knock that one out. Then we've got the one-state solution, one state, one nation, where the one nation is Palestine. Some people argue that. And then there's one state, one nation, where the one state, one nation is Israel, Greater Israel. And I think, Tony, you gave the answer to apartheid. It becomes more obviously apartheid if you think really that Israel controls the whole territory, in effect. And therefore, half the people don't have a vote at all, because there aren't any elections for those in the West Bank and Gaza, as you say, amongst all the other points that you made. But I still think we have to come back to looking at the idea of one state. There has to be a one-state solution. And I think that binational state is where we need to look, where we need to dig around and see, in this darkest hour, the possibility of a democratic answer in the idea of a one state, two nations solution. I'll just leave it there. Any comments on that? If you've got
personally, I am against a binational state. I think it is simply reframing the essential problem. I think the only answer is a single state, and I think the way it will eventually be achieved is through the simple argument that everybody in this area, from the river to the sea, should have equal rights. Once that's established, that there's no excuse for denying everybody equal rights, then the Israeli state ceases to exist. Tony, what do you think?
Well, I agree with you. I'm opposed to binationalism. There was a small section of the Zionists, Judah Magnus,
it was, yes.
Einstein, I think Martin Buber, who supported binationalism, and Hashem Hatzair, which later became Mapam, also, but in practice, I don't think it ever did. But nominally, it did until the war started. But if you had a binational state today, it would simply mean that Zionism would resurface under another name. I don't think, because I don't accept that the Israeli settlers, the Israeli Jewish settlers, are a nation, or if they are, they're an oppressor nation, so they have no right to self-determination, because self-determination means the right to be free from national oppression. Well, they're not nationally oppressed. The only solution is the South Africa one, which is a unitary state where it doesn't matter what color or race or whatever configuration you give, that you have equal rights. Of course, that leaves aside the social question, which is the redistribution of wealth and who controls that society. But certainly a unitary state is...
Just to add to that, which I'm sure Tony and Tina will agree, that equal rights, river to sea, means by definition that every refugee has the right to return. You can't ethnically cleanse somebody and then say that equal rights doesn't apply to you because you're not present. No, equal rights in a single state means that any refugee that wishes to returns or is given some compensation paid for by the countries that caused this problem, principally the UK and the US.
There's, of course, people like Moshe Machova argue that this actually cannot be solved within the boundaries of Israel, Palestine, and it needs a regional solution and a revolution in the Arab countries to get rid of those dictators running those countries, because one state, two state without anything changing ever will just possibly reverse the pose of oppression, or perhaps it will just create the same situation again on another level. But that wasn't the session we wanted to talk about the solutions, which is a tricky one. But it was really important today to look back at the role of Britain in particular in pushing forward the Zionist enterprise, the Zionist state, and supporting that, and the Balfour Declaration, etc. And both speakers have made a really good introductions and answered patiently the many questions on those issues. And the fact that Tony was arrested yesterday for being critical of Israel certainly shows why this is so hugely important to get right and to understand what's happening. Where Israel now is being used to suppress free speech as well. You're not allowed to be critical of Israel. Anti-Semitism has been redefined from hostility to Jews to hostility to Israel. Any criticism of Israel now is being shut down with the toughest sanctions by the state, which is really important that we show solidarity to Tony and also Mick Napier, who's been arrested, I understand, at a demonstration in Glasgow for saying something critical of Israel or mentioning the word Hamas, I think was his crime. Absolutely ridiculous. And it's just important that shows like this stand up to this, understand what's really going on beyond the headlines. We're going to take a Christmas break, and we're coming back on January the 11th, taking a look at Norman Finkelstein's brilliant book, The Holocaust Industry. I urge comrades to read it beforehand. We'll have an introduction by Ian Spencer, and I'm sure we're going to have a really good discussion. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Tony. Tony, I hope you get all your computers and phones back soon.
Well, yes, I've got OneDrive, so I'll get my files back anyway.
Good. What a nightmare. Thank you very much both for joining us tonight. Thank you for the audience, for your questions.
Thanks a lot.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.